the houses with tremendous amount of food, meat and cheese, and came partly back already with little wagons full of food. And also a lot of people died on the way to the village because they ate so much and their stomachs couldn't take it, they couldn't digest it, and they just died in the street.
We're going to stop now and change the tape. Ilse Hess. When we finished the last tape, you were telling us how your husband had gone into the village with some of the Hungarian women from the train and found the food. Could you continue the story?
He found a house where there was a small wagon in the backyard. They just took the wagon and went further down where there were stores and houses and packed as much food as they could see and find and loaded it on the wagon. There was sausage and cheese and bread and all the things we had dreamed of. The Hungarian women were very much interested in paprika and other spices. They figured the meat and the cheese would come later. So with his wagon full, they came all back to the car, to the train, and threw it inside the train. They didn't even take time to neatly put it in the train because they wanted to go on another journey for food. Until I all of a sudden said, "What are we doing here in the train? Why don't we go to the village?" Which must have been a great idea because everyone packed whatever they could carry. And we took the cart because meanwhile the Hungarians had left again, and put our two small children in front like little horses. No one could really walk fast. We were all too weak and too sick. We got, I must say, one of the smallest houses. It was a house behind, a little house built behind the main house, which was probably built for the parents and where the children took over the main house. We also got to know that the place where we stayed was named Tröbitz. Tröbitz was a small town, almost like a village, and had 700 people living there. Some of them had left the city because they saw, or the village, they saw the Russians coming and they didn't want to go to a slaughter, through a slaughter. Some of the people stayed in their houses. The whole village consisted only of women. The men were either at the front or dead. So most of the women I experienced were very helpful to us, or maybe also afraid that all of a sudden in this small place 2,000 Jews appeared. Whatever dead Jews we had on the train at that point were buried there, just dug in a field with a marker, because we knew that within the next short while many will be added. So the small house we occupied had a kitchen, a small room, and a bedroom. The first thing, the woman who owned this place made a fire for us and put up buckets and buckets of water, because we didn't even think so much about food at that point than to get clean. And whatever water we used, she replenished with new water. So by the time I had washed myself and the children, I had already in my head to cook something. While my husband was undressing to take his tub bath, a knock on the door, and a Russian came in to arrest my husband. He had watched him coming towards the village and thought that he was a German Gentile who was hiding among the Jews to save his life. And it took quite some time to convince him that he also was a Jew. So then he left, and we cooked a meal. We were very careful with our reserves because we didn't know what the next day would bring. This was the first time in almost 2 years that we saw a bed. There were 2 beds in the room, one on each side. There were large beds, white beds with white sheets, and down blankets, bedding. So my husband got into one bed, and the children wanted to stay with me. Although there was a sofa in the room, I said, I'm staying on the sofa, I'm sleeping there. They protested, so the 3 of us slept together. Now the next morning we looked around the place, what there was to be had. My husband saw a bike, which he right away took inside. In Dutch they call this, he organized it. Whatever you took without money, you organized. On his first trip, although he didn't know where he was going on this bike, he realized that he needed a second bike because the Russians would stop him, not for the bike, but for the bell. So he drove around and found a few miles ahead a store and also some deserted houses. He went inside and took everything what was edible and came home with tremendous amounts of eggs and butter and bread and a half-cooked chicken the people had left, and one goose, I remember, they had already hung up to kill. So he brought all this stuff home, and we were cooking and baking the whole day. The tragic was that every day some of our people died. And on the marker it said, it was just a wooden marker in a space. It was not a cemetery, it was in a space. It said on the marker, here lie 500 something people, Jewish prisoners from the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, close to their homeland. The light of freedom came too late for them. The Russians knew after 3 days that there were a lot of typhus patients among the Jews, and they were deadly afraid they would get it. So they made rounds every morning from house to house to look who had typhus, because it's very visible. Your eyes are glistening, and your head is red, and you are hot, and you are shaking. So they went from house to house. If they saw anyone looking like typhus, they would take them to a quarantine where they shaved your hair, and most people stayed there, never got out. The morning they came to my house, to our house, I saw them coming because this house was so low that the moment whenever you looked through the window or the door, you knew what was happening on the ground. I started working very hard in the kitchen, lying on my knees with a rag, cleaning the kitchen floor. So they figured someone who is so sick cannot work that hard. So they left. Over the time we found out that we never would get to know the Russians. It was first a language barrier, and we only knew they loved children. They were wonderful with the children. They gave them candy, they took them by the hand, but they also needed women. They went from door to door every single night and raping in front of their husbands, in front of their children, whoever they could get. Was a real horrible story. I mean, after all this tragedy, I never left the house. I mean, I left the house, but the house was inside a yard, and there was a big door locking it or closing it. So I never went outside. I just stayed around there and waited till the food came home. One day, my children who played outside came through this door and had 2 Russians by their hand. They wanted to show them their mommy. So that evening was horrible. I told it to my husband. It happened that this Dr. Alaluf, who gave me the job in Bergen-Belsen, was also in Tröbitz. And he didn't live far away from us, and I knew that he spoke a little bit Russian. So he came that night and told us what to do. We should close the windows and have a chair near the window that I could jump out. And if they would be next door in another house, we should call him and he would come. Well, we did all this. The only thing, a Russian came, and I was already ready to jump when he motioned me to sit down. He was a high officer in the Russian army, and told us, he spoke a little bit English, and told us that he was looking for Russians who were raping women. And the moment we saw one or heard about one or someone would come, they would be heavily punished. We really didn't believe this because someone could have been on the way. So we called this Dr. Alalov, and he stayed that night with us. Otherwise, the weather was beautiful. And the garden was beautiful, and we had fresh vegetable, and the children really enjoyed it. For the first time they could eat whatever they wanted. And one day Stephen told me that the man next door was building a beautiful barrack. And I couldn't believe what he was talking. Well, what happened? The man was building a coffin. So we saw that our stay in Tröbitz would be much longer than we had expected. And we also instinctively realized that word of our staying there had not gotten out, because the Allies knew everything what had happened in Europe, and no one even knew anything about us. Later on we knew that the Russians had started already their policy of secrecy and did not let on to anything that they had stormed a train, or they held, at that time there were only 12, much less Jews, but a young couple there had stolen 2 bikes. I mean, everything was stolen, no one had money. And went outside Tröbitz, just not knowing where to go. But they could only have been maybe 10 or 15 miles from there, where the Allies were. And they told them that there is a whole city full of Jews. And it was we were there already anywhere between 8 or 10 weeks, when finally the Americans came with trucks to pick us up.
And where did you go when the Americans came?
First of all, we took tremendous bags of bread and food with us, because we never knew where we would be the next day. And the Americans were very friendly, and I think most of them were from the Black Brigade. They were very friendly, very helpful. They put us on the truck, and they took us to Leipzig. And in Leipzig they unloaded us also at some barracks, which were there. So they told us to sleep in the barracks. We saw right away there were straw mattresses on these bunks, which we didn't touch. We threw them all out, because we knew straw mattresses breed lice. But there was a whole wall full of wooden lockers for the military. And we looked in the back of the lockers, and they were just wood, no ornaments or anything, only in front they had a lock. So we turned all the lockers out. It looked almost like a wooden stage, and slept on this wooden lockers. We got food, and but we really had hoped to get home anywhere. But we felt at that time already that it must have started in Tröbitz, and we didn't know about it, that a self-appointed liaison officer of the German and Dutch Jews had decided that the German Jews were not to come back with them to Holland. And a verbal war broke out, and I was always happy when it was only verbal. And even some Dutch Jews thought that this was unheard of and will not happen. On the last day we got vouchers to go to the city to pick up rations to buy something. Nothing at that time to buy, just the rations. So we went on a trolley and went into the city to get this ration and went back home to the barracks in Leipzig. When we came there, the men were all on this big field, which belonged to the barracks, an exercising field, military field, and told us, fast, the train is leaving. Well, the Americans had told them that the train was already in the station to take us back to Holland, and it only had another 5 or 10 minutes it would wait, and then we had to stay there. This was a terrible situation, but the trains also couldn't wait endlessly because repatriates were on the trains and soldiers and veterans, war veterans who had been wounded somewhere. But the train had waited for us.
So what happened next?
So we went on this train. My husband was made supervisor of the train. All windows were broken. I mean, partly the panes were completely gone. And the nights were very cold. And we got food, and we had food with us. And the Americans in Leipzig had given us Red Cross packages. But it took 4 days and 4 nights to reach the Dutch border.
And what happened at the Dutch border?
Meanwhile, the war was over. I mean, it was over. The shooting was over, let's say. The war wasn't over, but the shooting was over. We arrived at the Dutch border, and they interrogated everyone coming from the train because a lot of repatriates came from Germany back to Holland, who had worked in Germany or for the Nazis during the war. And they would put to one side, and the Dutch private people were put to another side, and all of a sudden a very small group, maybe 20, 25, were left standing by themselves. And we realized they were all German Jews. Only. The others were given tickets for another train to go back home to Holland, and we were completely isolated there. We were interrogated, and then we were told that we were under arrest by the Dutch.
And what happened after that?
Since it was evening, they wanted us to sleep in a certain room. The whole building looked like a school. And all we heard was German. Some spoke Dutch, but most of them spoke German. And we realized that this was a transit camp for Nazis who had been caught in Holland. So we refused to lie down with the Nazis. We just were standing there, children and all. They told us to go to sleep, but we didn't. We just waited. But the next day, the reality came. They told us that now, under Dutch law, we are not Jews anymore. we are German again. And we fall under the laws that Germans are not to be admitted to Amsterdam. My children were born in Amsterdam. So they made out a sheet of paper for you. It was pre-printed, why you were not admitted to Harland. And it said collaborator and all these things. And we all got on our persona a sign suspicious. It was, so after this was done, the men were led away to a different place. They got prison numbers, which we didn't even have in Bergen-Belsen, around their neck. They took our Red Cross packages from us. We were screamed at. The men were not supposed to see their wives or be with them. They were in a completely different place. They had to work hard, had hardly anything to eat. The children didn't get anything. Some people who wanted to pick up their friends and relatives were not admitted. The only time we had friends nearby, right by the German border, and she picked up Stephen and took her to her house, which was nearby.
She took just Stephen?
Just Stephen, because they felt they only let one go and then the other one will not run. And Stephen came back, and when he came back he told me they have such a beautiful barrack. He meant the house. He never had seen a real house or didn't remember. And then he had stuffed underneath his T-shirt every roll of toilet paper he could find, because he hadn't seen this in 2 years.
How long were you at this camp?
Well, it's this we were almost a week, but we were transferred from this school to a monastery, a former monastery, which was practically right on the border. So we figured our next trip will be very short, a few steps and we are in Germany again. They want us out. But when a lawyer who was with us in Bergen-Belsen, Mr. de Vries, heard about it, he was disgusted, and he complained bitterly to the government, and he came to Marmelis, which was his border town, and he got us released. And I even have the slip of release where they, from the safety department, said my name and my husband, not named, only my name, my husband and 2 children will be